The wolves were closer tonight. Thomas Callahan could feel it in his bones, a low hum of dread that vibrated up from the frozen ground. He stood on the porch, lantern held high, the yellow light cutting a nervous circle in the dark. Beyond that light, the Montana night was absolute, a crushing blackness, broken only by a sliver of moon. The cries came again, sharp and hungry, not the lonely howl of a lone hunter, but the coordinated yips of a pack on the move. They were organized, too organized. Shapes darted between the pines at the edge of his property. The horses in the barn knew it too. They stamped and whinnied, their breath exploding in panicked white clouds. A low, guttural growl rolled across the corral, and with it came the sickening sound of something snapping. Thomas's hand tightened on the lantern. Was that bone, or just a frozen branch? He couldn't be sure, and not being sure was the worst part. From inside the cabin, a child whimpered. The sound cut through the tension like a razor. He lowered the light and turned, his boots heavy on the wooden boards. Annie was sitting bolt upright in her cot. Her wild curls were a mess, her small hands twisting the worn patchwork quilt into knots. It had been 47 days since she'd last spoken. 47 days since they'd lowered her mother into the hard, unforgiving earth. But her eyes, wide and terrified, screamed the questions her lips refused to form. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside her. His calloused hand, rough from mending fences and splitting wood, felt clumsy as he tried to smooth her hair. "They won't come this close," he whispered, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He wasn't certain of anything anymore. Annie didn't relax. She just stared past him, her gaze fixed on the dark window, where another howl rose, closer this time. Much closer. She launched herself into his arms, a silent, trembling weight. He held her tight, his own fear a cold knot in his gut. The scent of cedarwood smoke from his clothes was the only comfort he could offer. He wished he could sing her a song, tell her a story, promise her that the monsters weren't real. But her mother was the one with the songs. All he had left was the grind of the ranch, the endless work that kept them fed, but did nothing to fill the echoing silence in their lives. He waited until her breathing evened out, then gently laid her back down. He stoked the embers in the stove, watching the sparks flare and die, each one a tiny ghost in the dark. His life was a series of motions: chop wood, mend fence, feed horses, stare into the fire. The days bled into one another, held together only by Annie's quiet, fragile presence and the gaping wound of what they had lost. By dawn, the world outside was still. The wolves were gone. Thomas checked the corral, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The horses were skittish but unharmed. The fence was intact. But near the southern post, half hidden in the snow, was a single muddy footprint. It was too large for a wolf and too deep. It was the print of a man's boot. Thomas saddled his gray gelding, the cold leather groaning in protest. He rode the fence line, his breath a plume of white in the biting air. The Montana landscape stretched out in every direction, a vast empty canvas of rolling hills and brittle grass. But today it didn't feel empty. It felt like it was watching him. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a crow, seemed to carry a message he couldn't decipher. The silence at home was a ghost. The silence out here was a predator. When he got back, a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, Annie sat at the table, her wooden doll clutched in her lap. The doll's painted eyes were chipped and faded, staring into nothing. Annie didn't even look up when he walked in. The air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken grief. He was pouring oats into a pot when a sharp knock echoed through the room. It was Henry Cooper, his oldest friend. His hat was dusted with frost, and he held 2 tins of coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. "Brought your beans," Henry said, his voice a little too cheerful as he stepped inside. "And something else you need." They sat at the table. Annie watched them from the corner, her expression guarded. Henry pushed the newspaper across the worn wood. A small advertisement was circled in pencil. It was from a marriage broker in St. Louis. Women seeking husbands, seeking homes in the West. Thomas's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. "I don't need a wife, Henry." "The hell you don't," Henry shot back, his voice dropping. "You need help. That little girl over there is fading away. You're raising her on silence and sorrow, Thomas. That ain't a foundation for a life. Henry leaned in closer, his eyes intense. You can't run this place and raise her right. Not alone. You're already half a ghost yourself. Look at you. Thomas said nothing. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Henry tapped the ad again, insistent. I'm not saying you have to love her. I'm saying you need someone to keep the house warm. Someone for Annie to look at who isn't haunted. He paused, then added, someone to watch your back. That last phrase hung in the air. It wasn't what a man said about finding a new bride. Thomas stared at the paper for a long moment. Then, with a deep sigh that seemed to pull up all the exhaustion inside him, he reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded, worn sheet of paper and laid it on the table. Henry's eyes widened. You already wrote one. Thomas just nodded. Henry picked it up and read the stark words aloud. I have a ranch, a child, and work that does not end. If you can bear dust, horse sweat, and silence, meet me at the depot. No past required, no promises offered. Henry let out a low whistle. Well, that'll charm the petticoats off him. I'm not looking for charm, Thomas said, his voice flat. I'm looking for someone who won't break. He stood and walked to the mantel. A faded photograph of his wife, Emmeline, sat next to a small wooden box. He opened the box and took out her gold wedding band. He turned it over and over in his fingers, the metal dull and cold. I'll mail this today, he said, setting the ring down next to the letter. But I won't wear a ring again. Henry's expression softened for a moment. You sure about this, Tom? Thomas didn't answer. He just looked at Annie. She had put her doll down. Her gaze was fixed on the simple gold ring, and her eyes, so much like her mother's, held a strange mixture of fear and something else, something he couldn't name. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her. She won't be your mama, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But she might keep the fire warm. For the first time in weeks, Annie moved. She lifted a small, fragile hand and placed it on his weathered cheek. Her touch was a whisper, but her gaze was steady. She gave him a single, solemn nod. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat, stood, and tucked the letter into his coat. The 3-mile ride to the post office felt longer than ever. The wind cut like a knife, and the silence of the prairie pressed in on him, heavier than any snow. He wasn't looking for love. Love was a fire that had burned him down to the foundations, leaving nothing but ash and memory. He just needed someone who wasn't afraid of the smoke. At the depot, the letter slid into the mail slot with a quiet thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. He stood there for a long time, half expecting the box to spit it back out. It didn't. On the ride home, the sun bled out across the horizon, and the lonely cry of the wolves started up once more. But as he listened, a chilling thought took root in his mind. The boot print. Henry's strange urgency. The feeling of being watched. What if he hadn't just mailed a letter? What if he'd just invited the wolf to his door? The stagecoach groaned to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust that shimmered in the cold evening air. A few stiff passengers climbed down, their boots thudding onto the packed earth. One of them was a woman. She was slight, almost swallowed by the vast Montana sky, and she moved with a careful, deliberate grace. She held a battered canvas suitcase in one hand, and with the other she gripped the rusted rail as if afraid the ground might give way beneath her. Her name was Rose Whitfield, and the horizon felt like a threat. The light here was sharp and unforgiving, revealing every crease in her travel-worn dress, every tired line etched around her eyes. She scanned the depot, a crooked bench, an ice-covered water trough, a single horse tied to a post, and leaning against that post, a man, arms crossed, hat pulled low. He didn't move. He just watched her. She knew it was him. Mr. Callahan, she said. Her voice was steady, a small victory against the tremor in her hands. He gave a single sharp nod. His shirt was worn, his forearms scarred by work and weather. He didn't smile. He didn't tip his hat. He just pushed himself off the post and walked toward her. Without a word, he took the suitcase from her hand. The suddenness of it surprised her. She had prepared herself for questions, for suspicion, maybe even for him to turn her away right then and there. She had not prepared herself for this crushing, absolute silence. He turned and walked toward his horse. She straightened her shoulders, a familiar act of defiance, and followed him. The ride to the ranch was a silent battle of wills. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic crunch of hooves on frozen ground. Rose kept her eyes locked on the distant, jagged mountains. Every jolt of the horse sent flashes of memory through her mind. A bottle raised in anger, the glittering shards of broken glass, the shouting, the blood spreading across a wooden floor. She hadn't wanted him to die, but she hadn't been willing to die either. That night she had burned her old life to the ground and walked away, carrying nothing but a new name and the ghost of who she used to be. The man beside her, Thomas Callahan, was as silent and immovable as the mountains themselves. Had he even read her letter? Or had he just seen the words he wanted to see? No past required, no promises offered. When they arrived, the ranch was a dark shape against a sky burning with orange and violet. The house was plain, weathered but solid. In the doorway, a small figure stood, holding a doll with chipped paint. "This is Annie," Thomas said, his voice low and rough, as if he hadn't used it in days. The little girl's eyes locked onto Rose. They were old eyes in a young face. She stared for a long, unnerving moment, then simply turned and vanished back inside the house. The dismissal was as clear as a slammed door. Rose slid from the saddle, her body aching from the long journey. The silence here was different from the silence of the open road. This silence had weight. It had history. "Where should I sleep?" she asked, her voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. Thomas gestured with his chin toward the barn. "Hay in the tack room. It's warm enough?" Rose held his gaze, searching for a flicker of kindness, of welcome, of anything at all. She found nothing but a carefully guarded distance. She nodded once and walked toward the barn. The smell of horses and hay, a strange, lonely welcome. She spread her thin blanket in a corner, her suitcase sitting beside her like a small tombstone. Sleep was a long time coming. When it finally did, it brought the nightmares with it, the screams, the feeling of blood, warm and sticky on her knuckles, the sound of a fist hammering on the door. She bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hand clutching at the empty air. And that's when she heard it, a faint creak of wood from above. She looked up. Framed in the high small window of the hayloft was a face, a small, pale face with wide, solemn eyes and a spill of wild curls. It was Annie. The child didn't make a sound. She just stared down at Rose, her expression unreadable in the gloom. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she was gone. Rose pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her racing heart. She lay back on the rough straw, but she didn't close her eyes. She stared up into the dark rafters, a chilling realization dawning on her. She hadn't just come to a house of silence. She had come to a house of watchers. Inside the cabin, Thomas sat at the table, the lantern light throwing long, dancing shadows across his face. He'd seen Annie go to the barn window. He'd seen her come back. He watched as she crept into the room and climbed onto the chair across from him, her small feet dangling far from the floor. "Did she scare you?" he asked, his voice a low mutter. Annie shook her head no. She hesitated for a moment, then climbed down from the chair. She padded over to an old linen chest in the corner, her bare feet silent on the wood. She pulled out a small folded patchwork blanket. Thomas frowned, confusion tightening his jaw. "What are you doing with that?" Annie didn't answer. She just clutched the blanket to her chest and walked to the door. Thomas followed her onto the porch. The night air was frigid. He watched, mystified, as his daughter, who hadn't shown an ounce of warmth to anyone in months, crossed the dark, frozen yard. She pulled open the heavy barn door and disappeared inside. Rose sat up, startled, as the small figure approached her through the gloom. Annie held the blanket out, a silent offering. Rose's throat went tight. She reached out and took it, her fingers brushing the child's. The fabric was soft, smelling of cedar and home. Annie didn't say a word. She just turned and padded back to the house, leaving Rose alone in the dark with the unexpected gift. From the porch, Thomas watched it all. He didn't understand it. This sudden act of kindness, this crack in the wall of silence he and his daughter had built around themselves, it unsettled him. He should have called Annie back, should have told her not to get attached, but he didn't. He just stood there as Rose curled up in the hay, clutching the little blanket as if it were a shield. The prairie wind howled outside, and for the first time, Thomas wondered if the real danger wasn't the wolves in the trees, but the secrets this strange, silent woman had carried with her into his home. Because as Rose drifted into a fitful sleep, she whispered a name in the dark. It wasn't her own. The days that followed were a silent, delicate dance. Rose moved through the small cabin like a ghost, taking up as little space as possible. She cooked and cleaned with a quiet efficiency that made Thomas uneasy. He was used to the chaos of grief, the dust bunnies in the corners, the meals skipped or burned. Her competence felt like an intrusion, a judgment on the way his world had fallen apart. He'd say good morning. She'd nod. He'd come in from the fields. She'd have a plate of food waiting on the table. They exchanged no more than a dozen words a day. He spent his time mending the south fence, the repetitive work a balm for his restless mind. He kept thinking about the boot print in the snow, about Henry's urgent visit. It all felt connected, somehow, to the woman now sleeping in his barn. He'd find himself watching her when she didn't know he was looking. He saw the way she always positioned herself with her back to a wall, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the way she flinched at the sound of a horse riding up too fast. This wasn't a woman looking for a home. This was a woman looking for a place to hide. One afternoon he came back to find Annie curled up on the porch steps. Her cheeks were flushed a dangerous red, and her head drooped against her knees. He scooped her into his arms. Her skin was on fire. "Annie," he said, his voice sharp with a sudden clawing panic. By the time he got her inside, her breathing was shallow and fast. He laid her on her cot, the memory of his wife's final days washing over him like an icy wave. The fever, the shivering, the helplessness. He remembered failing to stop it then, and the terror of failing again was a physical blow. "Rose!" he yelled, his voice cracking. She was there in an instant, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She took one look at Annie, and her entire demeanor changed. The quiet, timid woman vanished. In her place was someone calm, focused, and certain. "It's a fever," she said, her voice low and steady. "I can see that," Thomas snapped, the words torn from him by fear. Rose ignored his tone. Her eyes scanned Annie's small, trembling body. "Her lips are blue," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "This isn't just a fever." She turned to him, her gaze sharp. "Where do you keep your herbs?" He blinked, thrown. "Pantry, on the shelf." She didn't go to the pantry. She grabbed a small leather pouch from her suitcase in the barn and ran out the door, heading for the woods beyond the creek. Thomas stood frozen, watching her go. He was about to chase after her when a violent tremor shook Annie's body. She was seizing. "Hold her legs," Rose commanded, appearing back in the doorway, her apron now full of dark roots and strange-looking leaves. "What? Why?" Thomas stammered. "Just do it. Gently." He dropped to his knees, his big hands clumsy as he tried to still his daughter's thrashing limbs. Rose moved with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. She crushed the roots with a rock, mixed them with water, and began humming. It wasn't a song. It was a low, rhythmic chant, a sound older than language. It filled the small room, a thread of calm in the midst of chaos. The seizure passed. Annie went limp, her small body slick with sweat. Rose cradled her head, gently coaxing a few drops of a dark, bitter-smelling liquid between her lips. "Just a sip," she whispered. "That's it." Thomas stayed kneeling by the cot, his hands still gripping the blanket, his own body shaking. He watched Rose tend to Annie, her touch gentle but firm, her presence a solid, unyielding anchor in the storm of his fear. He had brought this woman here to cook and clean, to be a ghost in the background of his grief. But as he watched her fight for his daughter's life, he felt a deep, foundational crack run through the walls he had built around his heart. She wasn't just keeping the fire warm. She was standing between his daughter and the dark. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Annie's breathing was deep and even, her skin cool to the touch. She was sleeping peacefully. Rose sat in a chair beside the cot, her face pale with exhaustion, her hair falling loose from its bun. She didn't move, not even when Thomas quietly placed a mug of hot coffee on the table beside her. He went outside to work, his mind reeling. He was repairing a broken hinge on the barn door when he found it. Tucked into a crack in the wood, almost invisible, was a small carved wooden bird. It was exquisitely detailed, clearly the work of a skilled hand. It was the kind of thing a person might leave behind as a marker, a sign. He pocketed the carving, a new unease settling over him. This woman was full of secrets. Her knowledge of herbs wasn't simple folk medicine. It was something deeper, more practiced. The way she had chanted, the carving, it all pointed to a past far more complex than she had let on. Who was Rose Whitfield? And what had she really been running from? That evening Annie woke up. She blinked slowly, her eyes finding Rose, who was still sitting by her side. She reached out a small hand, and then she spoke. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, the first sound she had made in nearly 2 months, but it filled the cabin like a thunderclap. Stay! Thomas heard it from the hallway. The single word rooted him to the spot. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. But right behind it came a wave of dread. His daughter had chosen, and in doing so, she had tied their fate to a woman he knew nothing about. A woman who left secret carvings in his barn and fought off death with strange chance. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes, and Thomas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the storm was just beginning. The market at Dusty Creek was a chaotic symphony of noise. Wagon wheels clattered, chickens squawked, and merchants bellowed prices into the wind. Thomas held Annie's hand tightly, navigating the crowd. Rose walked a step behind them, her basket already half full. In town, she was different. She kept her head down, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. The quiet confidence she had at the ranch was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that set Thomas's teeth on edge. She had been with them for weeks now. Annie was talking again, small, hesitant sentences at first, but now her laughter had started to return, a sound Thomas thought he might never hear again. Yet Rose still moved like a woman expecting an ambush at any moment. While Thomas was bartering for nails at the blacksmith's stall, he saw Rose pause by a barrel of dried flowers, and he saw the man watching her. He was leaning against a post, a worn army coat pulled tight against the chill. His face was unshaven, but his eyes were sharp and focused. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Well, I'll be damned," the man muttered, his voice carrying on the wind. Rose froze, her back going rigid. The man pushed himself off the post and took a step toward her. "I know you," he said, his voice getting louder, drawing stares. "Or maybe it's the mark I know." As Rose reached for her basket, her sleeve slipped, just for a second. On the pale skin of her forearm, just below a long, jagged scar, was the faint, faded outline of a tattoo. A coiled snake. The man pointed a grimy finger at her. "That's her!" he shouted, his voice ringing across the square. "That's not Rose Whitfield. That's Lilith, the Black Widow of Cheyenne." A hush fell over the market. A butcher paused, his cleaver hovering over a block of meat. A mother grabbed her child's hand and pulled her back. Whispers erupted like sparks in dry grass. The Black Widow? The one who poisoned her husbands? Rose backed away, her face ashen, her knuckles white on the basket handle. "Please," she whispered, the word lost in the growing murmur. The man sneered. "Thought you could just disappear? Run off with the money and leave me to take the fall?" Thomas's voice cut through the noise, low and cold as a river stone. "She's with me." The man turned, his eyes full of scorn. "Then you're a bigger fool than you look, Callahan. You don't know what you've brought into your home. She's a poisoner. Left a trail of dead men and empty bank accounts all the way from Kansas." Thomas stepped between them, shielding Rose. His eyes were like chips of ice. "Say one more word." The man scoffed but held his tongue. The threat in Thomas's voice was unmistakable. People were still staring, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "Come," Thomas said gruffly. He took the basket from Rose's limp hand and led her and Annie back to the wagon. They rode home in a silence that was heavier and more terrible than any they had shared before. Rose stared at the horizon, her jaw set like stone. She looked like a woman who was watching her world burn down for the second time. Back at the ranch, she drifted out to the porch and sat on the steps, her hands clenched in her lap. Thomas found her there after he put a very quiet, very confused Annie to bed. "Talk," he said. It wasn't a request. Her gaze remained fixed on the darkening plains. His name was Elias, she began, her voice a dead monotone. He wasn't my husband. He was my partner. The man who recognized me. His name is Silas. He was part of it too. She finally looked at him, her eyes dark with secrets. We were grifters, Mr. Callahan. We'd find wealthy men, lonely men. I would marry them. And then they would have an accident. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. You killed them. No, she said, her voice shaking. I just played my part. Elias was the one who arranged things. He used herbs, poisons, things that looked like illness. I played the grieving widow. She took a shuddering breath. The last one in Cheyenne. It went wrong. Elias gave him too much. The man died too quickly. The doctor got suspicious. Elias and Silas planned to pin it on me. They called me the Black Widow. They created the legend themselves, a specter to cover their tracks while they took the money and ran. Her voice broke. I heard them planning it. I knew they were going to kill me to tie up the loose end. So I took what I could and I ran first. I thought if I came somewhere like this, somewhere quiet, I could disappear. Thomas's mind was spinning. The herbs, her knowledge, the chanting. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He had brought a killer, or at the very least a willing accomplice to killers, into his home. He had let her put her hands on his child. So you lied, he said, his voice rough. I survived, she whispered, the words fierce. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The entire foundation of the fragile trust they had built had just crumbled to dust. Annie is different since you came, he said, the words tasting like poison. She's laughing again. Rose's head snapped up. That isn't true. She's quiet around you now. She saw the tattoo. She heard what that man said. You brought this darkness here, to my home. His voice was brittle, cracking under the strain. You are not what she needs. I think you should leave. He saw the hope drain from her eyes, replaced by a familiar, soul-deep weariness. Are you sending me away because of what I did? She asked, her voice trembling. Or because you're terrified of what it means if you let yourself believe me? Thomas couldn't answer. His fists were clenched at his sides. His chest ached with a confusion so profound it felt like grief. He turned without another word and went back inside, the slam of the door echoing the finality of his decision. Rose sat alone on the porch as the stars came out, each one a cold, distant eye in the black sky. Later that night, Thomas sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He saw Annie's little patchwork blanket, the one Rose had used to wrap her in when the fever was at its worst, folded neatly on a chair. He picked it up. The scent of rose, of herbs and wood smoke, still clung to it. He had wanted silence and safety, but silence hadn't saved his daughter. This complicated, dangerous woman had. Out in the barn, Rose packed her small suitcase. She moved with a grim, practiced speed. A dress, a brush, her pouch of herbs. On top of it all, she placed the small patchwork blanket. She closed the lid, the soft click sounding as loud as a gunshot in the quiet barn. She didn't leave a note. She just slipped out into the darkness, the only sound the soft crunch of her boots on the frozen ground. Heading nowhere, with nothing but the ghosts of her past for company. By the time the sun rose, casting a pale, sickly light over the prairie, Rose Whitfield was gone, and Thomas Callahan was alone again, in a house that felt colder and emptier than it ever had before. Morning broke gray and bleak. Thomas woke to a silence that felt different. It wasn't the quiet of grief, it was the sharp, cutting silence of absence. He found Annie sitting up on her cot, her doll lying beside her, forgotten. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the small, empty room where Rose had slept. The bed was made, the quilt tucked in with military precision. On the pillow, folded into a neat square, was the patchwork blanket. Annie's small lips parted. A single word, a name, escaped like a wounded bird. Rose. Thomas's throat closed up. He knelt beside his daughter. She's gone, Annie. The little girl turned to him, and for the first time, he saw not just sadness in her eyes, but a hot, fierce anger. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than he had ever heard it. "You made her go." The accusation struck him with the force of a physical blow. Before he could respond, she scrambled off the cot and ran to the table. She yanked open a drawer, her small hands fumbling until they found a stub of crayon and a scrap of wrapping paper. She began to draw, her movements jerky and furious. Thomas watched, his heart breaking. When she was done, she folded the paper and pushed it across the table toward him. Her eyes were wet but defiant. With trembling fingers, he picked it up and unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, a crude house with smoke curling from the chimney. 3 figures holding hands, a tall man, a small girl, and a woman with long hair. Underneath, in messy backward letters, she had written a single word. Home. It broke him. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat. He hadn't wept when he buried his wife. He had stood stoic and dry-eyed, a pillar of stone for his daughter to lean on. But now the dam burst. He turned away from Annie, covering his face with his hands as years of unshed grief and a fresh, sharp regret racked his body. Annie climbed onto a chair and curled into a small ball, her own quiet sobs shaking her small frame. After a long moment, he pulled her into his arms, pressing his face into her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words choked and raw. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was keeping you safe." He spent the rest of the day in a desperate, frantic search. He rode to Dusty Creek, asking at the boarding house, the depot, the general store. Had anyone seen a woman, slight, with tired eyes and a long scar on her arm? No one had. It was as if she had been a ghost all along and had simply dissolved back into the prairie wind. He returned to the ranch at dusk, bone-weary and empty-handed. The cabin felt like a tomb. Annie was asleep at the table, her head resting on her crayon drawing. He carried her to bed, tucked her in, and then stood before the mantel. Emmeline's photograph stared back at him, her smile a relic from another lifetime. He took Annie's drawing and placed it beside the photo. Then he saw it. Lying next to the wooden box where he kept Emmeline's ring was the small carved bird he'd found in the barn. Rose must have left it there before she fled. A final, silent message. He picked it up. It felt warm in his hand. "I lost you, Emmeline," he whispered to the photograph, his voice hoarse. "And I tried to lock the whole world out after you. I was so afraid of someone taking your place." His voice cracked. "But she never tried to take. She only tried to give." The fire crackled in the hearth. He sank into a chair, the carved bird still clutched in his hand. For the first time in years, he prayed. Not for a good harvest or for safety from the wolves. He prayed for a woman with a haunted past and secrets he couldn't comprehend. A woman who carried her scars like armor, but who still knew how to sing a child back from the brink of death. Sleep brought nightmares. He dreamt of wolves with intelligent human eyes circling his ranch. He dreamt of Silas, the man from the market, laughing as he set fire to the barn. And he dreamt of Rose, standing in the middle of a burning field, her face streaked with soot, her eyes pleading with him for something he couldn't understand. He woke before dawn with a jolt, his heart pounding. The house was still, the air cold. But he knew with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty that this was not over. Her leaving wasn't an end. It was a beginning. Her past wasn't just chasing her. It was coming for them all. And far away, on the road to Dusty Creek, a man named Jasper Doyle, a man with a cruel smile and Elias's cold eyes, was asking the very same questions Thomas had. He wasn't looking for a runaway. He was hunting for a witness. The storm rolled in from the north, a great bruised wall of cloud that swallowed the mountains whole. By late afternoon, the wind was screaming across the plains, driving sheets of rain sideways against the cabin. Thomas worked fast, securing the barn, checking the shutters. There was a malevolence to this storm, a feeling of teeth and claws in the wind. He brought Annie inside and barred the door, the heavy wooden beam thudding into place. Every gust of wind sounded like a fist pounding on the walls. Every scrape of a branch sounded like fingernails dragging across the roof. The knock, when it came, was so loud it was almost lost in the thunder. It wasn't a polite rap. It was a heavy, deliberate banging, the sound of someone who knew the door was barred and didn't care. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He grabbed the rifle he kept propped by the door. "Stay back," he whispered to Annie, who had flattened herself into the corner, her eyes wide with terror. He lifted the bar and pulled the door open a crack. The storm roared in, bringing with it the smell of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and pure, undiluted menace. A man stood on the porch, a hulking shape in a soaked coat. His hat was pulled low, but Thomas could see a yellow, broken-toothed grin. "Thomas Callahan," the man said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Thomas replied, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. The stranger tilted his head back, revealing a pair of cold, dead eyes. "Name's Jasper Doyle. I'm a friend of Elias. I'm here for the woman you've been keeping. Lilith." The name hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. "She's not here." Jasper's grin widened. "Don't lie to me, farmer. Silas sent word. She was here. She knows where Elias hid the money before he disappeared. And I aim to collect." He took a step forward, his boots squelching on the wet porch boards. "You're not collecting anything," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. From behind him, Annie let out a small whimper. Jasper's dead eyes flicked past Thomas and caught the movement in the shadows. "Well, what have we here?" he drawled. "She playing house now? Got herself a little ready-made family?" In a single fluid motion, Thomas stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind him, shielding Annie from the man's poisonous gaze. The rain hit him like a physical force, soaking him in seconds. He leveled the rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at Jasper's chest. "Get off my land!" Jasper just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that was swallowed by the wind. "Make me!" Lightning bleached the world white for a split second, freezing them in a terrifying tableau. The farmer, the killer, and the storm. And then a sound that made both men freeze, the slow, groaning creak of the barn door opening. A figure stepped out into the deluge. It was Rose. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her dress was soaked through, but her eyes were blazing. She hadn't left. She had been hiding in the barn, waiting for him. "Jasper," she said, her voice clear and steady above the howl of the wind. He barked a laugh. "Lilith, you always did have a flair for the dramatic. Did you really think this dirt scratcher could protect you from me?" "I didn't run this time, Jasper," she said, taking a step forward. "I stayed to finish it." His grin vanished, replaced by a snarl. "You ruined everything. You and Elias. You were supposed to be the perfect team, but you got soft, and he got greedy. He was never going to cut me in, was he?" Thomas's mind raced. This wasn't about a simple grift. This was a nest of vipers, and he and Annie were trapped in the middle of it. "She's not yours," Thomas said, shifting his stance to keep himself between them. Jasper's hand disappeared inside his coat. When it reappeared, it was holding a revolver. The metal gleamed wetly in the gloom. "Then I'll just have to bury you both right here," he spat. "Last chance, farmer. Put the gun down." The standoff stretched for an eternity. Thunder cracked overhead. From inside the house, Annie cried out, "Papa!" The sound shattered Thomas's control. It was all the distraction Jasper needed. He raised the revolver. But Thomas was faster. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The explosion, a deafening crack that split the storm. Jasper screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain. His revolver clattered to the porch as he staggered back, clutching a hand that was now a mangled ruin of blood and bone. He collapsed to his knees in the mud, cursing, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. Thomas kicked the revolver away, his own rifle still trained on the man's chest. Rose stood frozen, her face a pale oval in the rain, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cabin door flew open. "Papa!" Annie screamed again. "It's all right," Thomas called back, his voice shaking. "He's done." Jasper groaned in the mud, hatred burning in his eyes even as the pain overwhelmed him. "This isn't over, Callahan," he hissed. But it was. The rifle shot had been heard in town, and it wasn't long before the sheriff and two deputies rode up, their lanterns swinging in the storm. They hauled a bleeding, sputtering Jasper to his feet and led him away. Thomas finally lowered the rifle, a deep tremor running through his arms. Rose moved toward him, her eyes shining with tears that the rain couldn't wash away. They stood there for a moment, in the heart of the storm, silent, soaked, but unbroken. When they were finally back inside, the door barred against the night, Annie ran straight into Rose's arms, clinging to her as if she would never let go. Rose held her tight, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm of relief. Thomas watched them, the warm lantern light chasing away the shadows. He had just shot a man to protect this woman. He hadn't just defended his ranch, he had defended his family. He knew with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating that the line had been crossed. The fight with Jasper was over, but the bigger fight, the one for their future, had just begun. The town would be buzzing with questions by morning, and he would have to choose once and for all whether to stand with this woman in the light or let the shadows of her past swallow them all. The rain stopped before sunrise, but the air in Dusty Creek was thick with gossip. The story of the shootout at the Callahan Ranch had spread like a wildfire. By the time Thomas hitched his wagon, half the valley was convinced he was harboring a notorious black widow who had bewitched him into committing murder. Rose didn't want to go to town. Let them talk, she pleaded. It will pass. Thomas shook his head, his jaw set. Secrets are like rot, Rose. They don't pass. They just eat away at the foundations until the whole house comes down. We face this together, in the light. He helped her onto the wagon bench. Annie sat between them, a small, silent buffer against the world. As they rode into town, the whispers started. Curtains twitched in windows. Men stopped their work to stare. Women gathered in tight little knots, their eyes following Rose with a mixture of fear and condemnation. There she is, a voice hissed. The killer. Rose flinched as if struck. She felt every stare like a physical touch, every whispered word a brand on her skin. Thomas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store. A crowd had already started to form. The blacksmith, the preacher's wife, even the sheriff stood on the boardwalk, their arms crossed, their faces grim. Thomas dismounted and then turned, offering his hand to Rose. She hesitated. Taking his hand in the middle of this hostile audience was a declaration. It was an alliance. After a beat, she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was strong and steady. Together they stepped onto the boardwalk. Thomas didn't wait for the questions. He turned to face the crowd, his voice ringing out, clear and strong, across the dusty square. You have questions about this woman? He began. You've heard stories. Well, now you'll hear the truth. A hush fell over the onlookers. This woman's name is Rose. She came to my home in answer to a letter. She came seeking shelter, and she found a house full of grief. His eyes scanned the crowd, meeting every hostile gaze without flinching. When my daughter was struck down by a poison that killed my strongest bull, this woman, with her own hands and her own knowledge, saved her life. A murmur went through the crowd. This was a new detail, a complication to the simple, juicy story of a villainess. And when a man from her past, a violent, evil man, came to my home to hurt her and my child, Thomas continued, his voice rising with controlled anger, she stood with me. She didn't run. She stood. And I did what any man in this valley would do. I protected my own. He paused, letting the words sink in. She is not the monster the stories tell you she is. She is a survivor. She is brave. And she is with me. He looked down at Rose, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. She is the one I choose. The finality in his voice was absolute. Rose's breath caught in her throat. Her heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. No one had ever stood for her, not once. The crowd shifted uneasy. The simple narrative of good versus evil had been shattered. The sheriff cleared his throat, his voice gruff. The law's got no quarrel with her, he announced. Jasper Doyle has confessed to being part of a criminal ring responsible for multiple deaths. He claims Rose was a victim, not a partner. What happened in Wyoming is their business. What happened at the Callahan Ranch was self-defense. As far as Dusty Creek is concerned, the matter is closed. With the sheriff's pronouncement, the tension broke. The crowd began to disperse, the whispers trailing off into grudging acceptance. The storm had passed. Thomas leaned close to Rose, his voice for her ears alone. It's done. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that for me? He looked out over the town, then back at her. because truth doesn't mean a thing if you're the only one who knows it. That evening, the ranch felt different. The air was lighter. The silence was comfortable. Annie tugged Rose into the kitchen, proudly showing her the crayon drawing of their family. She pointed to the woman in the picture, a wide, happy smile spreading across her face. "Mama," she said, the word now full of certainty and love. Rose knelt and pulled the little girl into a fierce hug, tears finally streaming down her face. "I'm here," she whispered into Annie's hair. "I'm right here." Thomas watched them from the doorway, a knot in his chest loosening for the first time in years. He had spent so long trying to preserve a memory, to keep his life a perfect, sterile monument to the woman he had lost. He saw now that he had been wrong. The best way to honor the love he'd had with Emmeline wasn't to lock his heart away. It was to have the courage to let it beat again. Later, after Annie was asleep, they stood on the porch together, watching the stars prick the vast, dark canvas of the sky. "I don't know how to be anything but broken pieces," Rose said quietly. He stood beside her, not touching, but close enough for her to feel his presence like a shield. "Then we'll be broken together," he said, his voice rough. "Seems to me that's still enough." In the quiet house behind them, Annie murmured in her sleep, a single happy word that drifted out into the cool night air. "Mama." Rose pressed a hand to her mouth. Hope, a feeling she thought had died long ago, flooding her heart. Thomas reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the railing. A silent promise, a choice made. Tomorrow would come, with all its uncertainties. But tonight, under the endless Montana sky, three broken people had found the missing pieces of their hearts in the most unlikely of places. They had stopped just surviving. They had started to belong. And they knew, in the quiet certainty of that moment, that whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced the storm, together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the edge of the map.